Hello to all the folks who are jumping on. We're going to go ahead and get started here because we're right at the hour. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Jean to get us started.
Thank you, Kennedy. Well, welcome to The View from Washington. I'm Jean Hamerman, the Executive Director with the Center for Creative Land Recycling, also known as CCLEAR, and I'm joined by Kennedy Odell, Senior Manager of Advocacy at Smart Growth America. Together, Smart Growth America and CCLEAR co-manage the National Brownfields Coalition. And just by way of background, Smart Growth America empowers communities through technical assistance, advocacy, and thought leadership to create livable places. And CCLEAR is the leading national not-for-profit championing the beneficial reuse of contaminated and underutilized properties for healthy communities. You can see why we were a good match to join forces to manage the coalition. Next. Recently, we've been moving from stretches of silence to high-profile House committee hearings, and from proposed and actual EPA funding cuts to the announcement of substantial grant awards. It's been challenging to keep up and difficult to piece together reliable information about the status of the Brownfields program, let alone how to provide input and effectively advocate for legislation funding and improvements to existing practices. That's exactly why we're here today. We'll start with a brief look at the history of brownfields and the evolution of the National Brownfields Coalition, underscoring why your involvement is more important than ever to ensure brownfield redevelopment remains a national priority. From there, we'll turn to the current federal policy and legislative landscape. Most importantly, we want to open a meaningful dialogue with you. By acting together, we can be a powerful force for unlocking environmental and economic benefits of brownfield redevelopment. With an uncertain and ever-shifting landscape, today's presentation reflects the most current information available as of today. And we will not be addressing complex federal landscape related to cuts in grants or programs at EPA and other federal agencies on this webinar. As always, please put comments and questions in the chat so we can address them. Next. To set the context for the policy discussion, let's look at a legislative timeline. The EPA was signed into law by Richard Nixon in 1970. And now we're going to jump to 1980 when CERCLA, also known as the Superfund Law, was passed. Importantly, CERCLA granted the EPA the authority to investigate and clean up sites where there's an imminent threat to public health or the environment. The act also included provisions for identifying responsible parties and holding them liable for cleanup costs. It has been amended since, but it is really the cornerstone of environmental law. There's a real call out to ordinary citizens, the women, mothers, residents of Love Canal, who you see marching in the picture to protest toxic emissions from a chemical company that was contaminating their homes and causing severe health risks. And it's really their voices and actions that help deliver this federal program. And so while the initial priority was on these imminent risk Superfund sites, it really became clear that there were even more sites with various sizes, locations, source contamination that posed significant environmental and economic challenges, but didn't meet the criteria of a Superfund. And because of liability and the cost of assessment and cleanup, no one would touch these sites, resulting in sort of urban center donuts, where redevelopment was taking place in some areas, but adjacent and previously used properties suspected or known to be contaminated lay dormant and undeveloped. This pushed development to outer urban cores and contributed to urban sprawl. So recognition of the need to address these sites grew through the 1990s and generated early pilot grant programs, studies of these sites, voluntary cleanup programs, a federal tax incentive program, which since elapsed and which we are advocating to restore, and convening of practitioners. In 2002, the Small Business Liability Act codified EPA practices and policies, including grant funds for brownfield assessment and cleanup, and it clarified liability protections under CERCLA, including some exemptions for innocent and contiguous landowners. And it also enhanced the state and tribal response programs. And then in 2018, the BUILD Act reauthorized the Brownfield program, and it further amended brownfield provisions of CERCLA, expanded eligibility for funding, and provided more certainty for redevelopment. In 2021, the Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Acts provided unprecedented infusion of grant funds. For example, prior to these acts, the Brownfields grants, known as the Multipurpose Assessment Cleanup and Revolving Loan Fund, the suite of MARC grants, through general appropriations, awarded about $80 million. Last Friday, grant awards were announced in the amount of about $242 million, a fourfold increase. So we are hoping that the fiscal year 26 grant cycle, that would be the last year of the bill funding, will be maintained at that same level. And then really today, we'll really be focusing on what's happening in 2025. And the TBA listed there is not to be announced, but really to be activated. So meaning that your support and engagement will be what makes a difference in determining legislative outcomes. Next. Here's a quick quiz. In what year was the term brownfield first used? I'll give you a few minutes to put something in the chat, and there's a bonus if you can name the person the word is attributed to. So I'm going to go ahead, and if you could reveal the date, it's 1991, and it is attributed to our beloved colleague, Charlie Barch. So if you do the math, I haven't changed, go back to that slide for 1 minute. So if you do the math, 1991 to 2025 is 34 years. We have people on this call who weren't yet born in 1991. And so that makes us a relatively young field, but one that has really made meaningful progress that's grounded both in the environmental cleanup and in the financial leverage, the private investment, and the economic revitalization that is driven by brownfield redevelopment. And this dual impact is what's really garnered critical support from local, state, and federal leaders, as well as elected officials. However, there's more work to be done to really fully unlock the environmental and economic benefits of brownfield redevelopment, especially in rural, tribal, and disadvantaged communities. Next. The growth and the depth of brownfield stems from the commitment and actions of many individuals, especially dedicated staff at EPA and other federal agencies, as well as the organizations listed here, which played an outside leadership role in shaping and developing the work and really creating a deep bench of experienced and knowledgeable practitioners, including environmental consultants, lawyers, planners, and regulators. I just want to give a quick shout out to the U.S. Conference of Mayors, which back in the 1990s took a pivotal step of tasking its members with inventorying the status of industrial properties for their cities. They documented site location and size, contamination levels, reuse potential, publishing annual reports that brought national attention to the urgent need for funding and liability protections to support brownfield redevelopment. And those reports really were my two-go source of information when I first joined CCLAIR and informed us how we structured our technical assistance and educational programming. In 1993, the National Association of Local Government Environmental Professionals, also known as NALGEB, launched the Brownfields Communities Network, a groundbreaking effort to connect land reuse practitioners across the country. After all, no one really earns a master's degree in brown skills. We really all have to learn from each other and on-the-job training. So NALGEB provided one of the first platforms for sharing knowledge, experiences, and expertise. I mean, since then, we've seen a tremendous expansion of opportunities to build skills and stay informed. There are books, media coverage, webinars, the EPA's National Brownfields Training Conferences, and the work of the Technical Assistance to Brownfields, the TAB program. And so we're going to drop a link in the chat so you can get information about the TAB program and its many resources to support your redevelopment projects. And the strong bipartisan support we're experiencing is a result of these past and your current efforts to demonstrate the environmental and economic benefits of revitalizing brownfield sites. Next. The coalition really builds on this rich history of accomplishments of predecessor organizations to serve as your voice in Washington, D.C. We take a nonpartisan approach to policy and are committed to advocating for and representing brownfield practitioners. As a membership organization, we really rely on your input and active engagement to expand our impact and to seize this pivotal moment to secure critical legislative and budget victories for the brownfield community. Next. Broadly, the coalition advocates for policy and funding that advances brown work nationwide. We promote and use of brownfield programs and policies, and we connect brownfield stakeholders with useful resources and information. The coalition has a leadership team of environmental consultants, planning and law firms, cities, associations, and not-for-profits on the steering committee. And we hope that you'll connect with us about becoming a member and joining our leadership team. Next. Here's how you see us in action. We work on policy initiatives. We select and prep people to testify at congressional hearings. We connect with diverse stakeholders. We host events like Hill Day to meet with representatives and organize webinars. We draft sign-on letters and calls to action, and we compile information for our newsletter. Next. I'm now going to pass it to Kennedy Odell. Kennedy only joined Smart Growth America a few months ago, but has already made her mark by bringing new energy and expertise to the work of the coalition. Her previous position as the former Appropriations and Economic Development Director in the U.S. Senate means she understands the budget and legislative process, technical subjects that are unfamiliar to many of us. She has key relationships that are already benefiting the coalition. Her initiative, coupled with the power of our engaged members, positioned the coalition as the go-to organization for the latest information and strategic advocacy for brownfield policy and funding. Take it away, Kennedy.
Thanks so much, Jean. As Jean said, my name's Kennedy Odell, and I just finished 3 years in the U.S. Senate as Senator Bob Casey's Appropriations and Economic Development Director, working for the great state of the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, I should say. Was a fantastic experience and gave me a great deal of exposure to the wonderful work that brownfields practitioners do. So I want to start by thanking all of you for your dedicated work to revitalize and clean up many of these contaminated sites and communities across the country. But I was very excited to be able to join Smart Growth America and work with the National Brownfields Coalition at this critical moment in time. As Jean alluded to, it's been a period of uncertainty and fast movement within the federal government. In this space, I think it's easy to feel uncertain and quite nervous about the state of the federal program for brownfields and sort of the state of the federal government broadly. However, I wanted to start on a very positive note. This is the new EPA Administrator, Lee Zeldin. He was recently on a trip in Oklahoma where he said, there are so many brownfield projects that are in early stages across this entire country. To spotlight and highlight such a success story like these brownfield sites can give inspiration to communities across America as they go into the planning phases of what to create and how best to revitalize a site. This is a positive sign, and it builds on the bipartisan momentum that brownfields have had from their very conception, and is sort of indicative of the fact that brownfields find themselves in a unique place politically relative to some of the other initiatives that support brownfields and related work. So we're going to get into that in a little more detail here. So the current policy environment. First, we've discussed the bipartisanship, but I think it's important to talk about why. It's great for the economy and great for the environment. So regardless of whether a certain member of Congress is approaching from one angle or another, or from both, it's a win-win. That framework has been successful for the program to date and is one of our primary ways of engaging and talking about brownfields work. Now, there's also been broadly a tightening of federal spending across federal programs. That's both in the administrative costs, in grant awards, there have been frozen grants, et cetera. That general atmosphere is a challenge for robust funding programs, but the Brownfields program has some exciting and promising moments, and we'll get to those in a minute. In terms of the other things happening in Congress, or the Hill, as we call it down here, there's a major tax bill under consideration, which is the primary chance to reauthorize the brownfields deduction, which Jean alluded to earlier. We'll talk a little bit more about tax and brownfields. And then there are also some structural challenges on the Hill that complicate traditional processes. This is a function of sort of increased partisanship broadly. We talk about it in the course of sort of particular issues, but the fact is that Congress doesn't pass as many bills as it used to. sort of period. And also the basic mechanisms of how Congress considers legislation have changed. So, for example, it's very common for Congress to only pass a handful of pieces of legislation that sort of serve as, you call them like Christmas trees. Everybody hangs different ornaments on them. And then they pass as one large vehicle, as opposed to in previous decades, sort of individual pieces of legislation would build bipartisan momentum and move on their own. So, but those structural challenges around partisanship and process mean that things that used to function in a somewhat bipartisan, formulaic way, such as bill reauthorizations, which we'll define in a moment, no longer work that way. Okay, so I said we're going to start with positive signs. So EPA support for brownfields work appears to be continuing, which we view as something we should A, not take for granted, and B, we should sort of continue to monitor as we move forward. So the technical assistance to brownfields, the TAB funding remains intact as of right now. The EPA Office of Brownfields Land Revitalization and Regional Brownfields teams are somewhat intact. We're aware of some, what I'd call natural turnover happening within those programs, but to our knowledge, there have not been significant reductions in force to the brownfield specific staff in a coordinated way. And the National Brownfields Conference is on for Chicago, and that'll be in August of 2025. And that is also a promising sign. Most important for all of you, grants appear to be moving. So MARC grants were just announced, 207 awards totaling 224 million, which, as Jean said, is a significant amount of funding relative to previous fiscal years. The supplemental revolving loan funds were also, those recapitalization awards went out, and that was about $42 million. But it's good to see sort of the sustained momentum. It's not just a certain grant that's moving, it's several. And then the Brownfield Job Training Grant Program appears to be moving forward. It is important to note that for the majority of brownfields funding, we are still spending money that was authorized in the bipartisan infrastructure law, also called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That bill, which was passed in a bipartisan nature, provided advanced appropriations, which is essentially money ahead of schedule, guaranteed. And so we are still spending down those funds. Okay, other positive indicators. The bipartisan congressional support isn't just sort of lip service to stakeholders. We're also seeing it in very public forums. So the most important sort of early action this Congress came in the Senate, where the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, chaired by Senator Capito of West Virginia, voted a brownfield reauthorization bill out of committee unanimously. That's a positive sign, because when a chair like Chair Capito passes something very early in their in a Congress, it tends to indicate it is a priority for that member. So the fact that it was bipartisan, unanimous, and passed out of committee early in the Congress was a good sign. On the House side, we understand that they're currently going through their reauthorization drafting process, and the National Brownfields Coalition had a presence at the House hearing on brownfields on the Energy and Commerce Committee hearing on brownfields in March, and the House Transportation and Infrastructure hearing just recently, last few weeks ago, in May. And then in addition to these pieces, the brownfield deduction reauthorization language, which is a separate, we're going to talk about that on the next two slides. But the sort of the tax piece, a piece of legislation that would do that has also been recently reintroduced in a bipartisan way. And that is led, one of the co-leads there is Representative Mikey Sherrill of New Jersey, who is pictured in the second picture. Okay, so I've thrown around a lot of different words here, and I recognize that for folks who aren't based in DC, a lot of these terms can be opaque, I think is the friendly way to put it. And so I want to kind of demystify the three main pieces. We call them moving vehicles, but the three sort of main efforts that impact brownfields this year that are currently sort of working their way through Congress. So the first piece here is a reauthorization of the brownfields program. Generally, Congress reauthorizes programs across the federal government on a somewhat cyclical cadence. And a program-specific reauthorization process usually leads to a piece of legislation that is traditionally bipartisan, And it includes in its scope sort of programmatic adjustments, such as changing individual grant caps, expanding or limiting grant eligibilities, things like that. Think of that as the chance to sort of tweak and sort of restructure existing work. Other people think of it as a modernization bill. Reauthorizations can happen either explicitly as freestanding bills, as we've talked about, and as is sort of happening right now in this Congress, or they can be blended into larger bills. So I would say that, for example, in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the bill that was most recently passed, made a number of adjustments to the program, a la a reauthorization, but also included advanced appropriations for those programs, which is atypical of a reauthorization bill. Traditionally, reauthorization bills do not contain money, and the current piece of legislation that's been developed so far does not contain any funding. It authorizes an amount, but does not appropriate, which is what the sort of distinction is. Next, we'll head into major tax legislation. So we talked about this. Some folks may have heard of budget reconciliation. That is that is a big process, and I've got a slide where we'll dive into that as well. But budget reconciliation is a way to make policy that impacts sort of the bottom line spending that Congress does. And one of the primary components of any budget reconciliation bill is a tax package. Now this is traditionally partisan. One of the reasons that you utilize the budget reconciliation tool to pass legislation is because it is a way to get around the 60 vote threshold in the Senate. The 60 vote threshold in the Senate usually is functionally a requirement for bipartisanship. However, because most folks have not in the modern era had a so-called supermajority, the ability to have all of one party, basically 60 members of one party to be able to defeat the filibuster, which is getting up and talking a long time and basically delaying a bill. But the important thing to know is that with budget reconciliation, you only need 51 votes in the Senate, which allows you to take a partisan approach. Many pieces of significant legislation have moved through the reconciliation process, including the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act. So this is sort of becoming an increasingly common process. This vehicle is the best opportunity to pass the Brownfields redevelopment tax incentive that we'll discuss in more detail. And so that's kind of the big target there for brownfields. And lastly, but certainly not least, is the yearly appropriations process. So at this point, Congress is in the process of sort of making requests related to the fiscal year 2026 budget. The yearly appropriations process, as I discussed, it's a smaller amount of the overall funding currently going to the Brownfields program, but a line item in the budget is a very important marker. It's much easier to sort of increase or decrease something than to get a new thing added. So it's very important that Brownfields continues to show up in the budget, even if it's for a smaller amount, because we're still spending money that was previously approved to be spent. Now, appropriations is a particularly fraught process in a partisan environment. Appropriations bills are subject to that 60 vote threshold in the Senate. And so what has ended up happening several times, either short extensions or in last year for the full year, is that Congress ended up adopting what's called a continuing resolution. And a continuing resolution is basically an agreement between the various members of Congress that they cannot come to an agreement on a new budget for the government for that upcoming fiscal year. So they will simply use the previous fiscal year as a reference point. So for example, the FY25 bill, the fiscal year 25 bill, was not actually an original bill. It simply said, please reference the FY24 funding levels for nearly every program. And it made some small adjustments that we sort of think of as abnormalities. But in general, it's considered a continuing resolution. There's very limited certainty on where we'll end up. So it's important to advocate for brownfields funding in case they're able to draft a new fiscal year 26 bill. But particularly as Democrats have expressed concerns about administrative action taken to limit spending authorized by Congress, it seems increasingly unlikely that a new spending bill will be passed, and it's likely that we will end up on another continuing resolution. Regardless of how it works, there is a sustained need to protect funding for staffing, regardless of the mechanism we discussed. Okay, so those are our three pieces: reauthorization, tax legislation, which is moving through a process called budget reconciliation, and the yearly appropriations bill. I want to talk a little bit about tax because I think that budget reconciliation, tax package, etc., there's just a lot floating around on it, and some of it is not very clear. So the tax timeline and sort of budget reconciliation, the way it works is there's sort of a starting agreement that Congress comes to called a budget resolution. The budget resolution was passed there on April 10th, and that sort of allowed, in this case, the Republican majority in both chambers to begin drafting sort of various components of the bill to be ultimately stitched together into a final sort of comprehensive package. So here you see that on April 10th, Congress passed this. They then, all the members headed back to their districts for a congressional recess. We call that a district work period, where they're sort of meeting with constituents in their home areas. And while they were doing that, their staffers back in Washington were drafting the components of this legislation. And then through the end of April and the rest of May to date, the House committees were going through this legislation and ironing out various agreements on what they were going to spend. It's not, while tax is a major component of this, there's also provisions related to health, related to transportation, related to a million other subject areas. And that conversation is sort of all interrelated. And so I say that because I think it's when we think about advocacy, usually I think we think about advocacy, like advocating for the brownfields tax deduction in a sort of as its own thing, or like we're competing against other community development incentives. But in this particular context, you're actually competing against things like the child tax credit or cuts to or like an expansion of Medicaid and things like that. It's a very complex environment, sort of with all these moving pieces at once. And so we are now in what I would call the white box period. Um, and the white box period, I call it that because, we usually say in a black box, you don't really know what's going to go on and something comes at the end. White box period, we actually know exactly what Congress wants to do, which is come to consensus on what this piece of legislation will be and move it across the finish line. However, fiscal conservatives within the House Republican caucus in particular, but then a handful of Republican senators have expressed intense concern about the level of overall spending in this bill, and they don't view it as a fiscally responsible piece of legislation. So that's sort of one constraint within the Republican caucus. And then there's a handful of, a good number of moderates within the Republican caucus who are also sort of have some red lines that they don't want crossed either. And Speaker Mike Johnson and Majority Leader Thune over in the Senate are trying to wrap their arms around everyone, including the president himself, and get this bill over the finish line. They have set a deadline of July 4th to try and get this done. General thinking in Washington is that that may slide to later in July. But the actual sort of egg timer on this situation is that currently Republicans plan to include an increase in the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling is sort of the amount of debt the country can take on before we start to default on our loans. One of the big reasons to include it in this package is to make sure that your fiscal conservatives are willing to vote for an increase. If it were to be on its own, there's a question of whether the Republicans would have sort of the votes to get it done. Democrats tend to join on raising the debt ceiling. If the US were to default, it would be quite bad. But the debt ceiling is providing a functional egg timer because there's an estimate that around late August, early September, or around then, we will hit that threshold. And we will need a piece of legislation that makes changes to that prior to that. So that's sort of the thing that is animating and providing a real deadline for all of this work. There's a chance they do a short-term extension of some kind that kicks them likely to the end of the year, but that seems increasingly unlikely. Okay, now we've talked a great deal about all of this sort of global environment and what we're navigating, but I'd like to talk about the tax incentives specifically. So for those who are not familiar with it, in 1997, a deduction sort of came on the scene that allowed folks to fully deduct the cleanup costs of contaminated property in the year the costs were incurred. This provision is very important because it provides parity for the contaminator or polluter themselves and so-called volunteers who clean up a site. And that's because if you are the polluter or contaminator yourself, you're allowed to do this, deduct the cleanup costs in the first year, whereas others have to sort of spread it out over several years. The idea is to make contaminated sites more competitive to develop by providing this incentive. As I mentioned before, this was previously in existence. This is a reauthorization, not a new program fresh from the dirt. And it was used hundreds of times before it was sunset in the early 2010s. We know that this is up for consideration in a comprehensive tax package, and it was introduced. We call these, sort of in Hill parlance, we call the bill HR 815 a marker bill. It is not going to pass on its own, the Brownfields Redevelopment Tax Incentive Reauthorization Act. But the idea is you get it in and you build support around that as a marker for its inclusion in a larger package. So the marker bill has been introduced this Congress and in previous Congresses by a bipartisan pair of representatives. And we know that it's relatively low cost compared to some of the other provisions under consideration in the tax package. For example, just preserving the existing federal income tax brackets will cost over $2 trillion for the period of the bill's impact. We know that this will not cost anything close to that. That said, it is a crowded bill environment. Okay. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about the Brownfields reauthorization process. I mentioned that the Senate is on its way there, as is the House. And again, this is the cyclical modernization type of process that's going on. So Senate Bill 347 is the Brownfields Reauthorization Act in the House. And that was introduced by Senator Capito and Senator Blunt Rochester. A parallel process is playing out on a slightly longer time scale in the House. Those were those two hearings we were discussing earlier. They are sort of educating their members on what brownfields are because the House has higher turnover. And so many of the members on these committees of jurisdiction are brand new and may not be familiar with what a brownfield is, let alone if their staff is or not. So they've sort of been doing some education and some early solicitation of priorities for those bills. And we anticipate they will draft their own piece of legislation. But after each chamber drafts their piece of legislation, they'll then be combined. This is also called conferencing a bill. Basically, the idea is that the leaders, the chair and ranking member of each committee of jurisdiction, get together and they conference the legislation until they come up with something that they can all agree on. This all happens sort of backstage, which I think is not so intuitive. And rather than that compromise bill sort of being introduced and working through, first one chamber, then the other, and then going to the president's desk, well, not traditionally, I should say in the last several years, that bill will sort of be sitting on ice. And if folks see an opportunity to attach it to something else that's moving through the congressional process, they will. So for example, it's not uncommon for things like that to go on the yearly appropriations package should one pass, which is another reason the appropriations package is so interesting and something we should be monitoring. Now, the National Brownfields Coalition identified priorities for the reauthorization process and has advocated for them in both hearings and direct staff meetings with congressional staffers. Those priorities were developed by the membership. And that is really the coalition's value add to Congress, is that when we're going to look at some of these, they're quite in the weeds. But those staffers who are writing this bill, they are so far from practitioners themselves. They are often hearing things third hand on adjustments that need to happen. But instead, what the coalition does is it brings a group of practitioners together, lets them set the priorities for this reauthorization, and then puts them in direct conversation with congressional staff so that they don't have to just take our word for it. They can ask, why do you need this adjustment? And someone can explain in real life why not having that flexibility limited the success of a certain project. And it provides a really sort of potent, powerful message and input stream. Broadly on outlook, the bipartisanship in hearings and on the bill efforts to date is a positive sign, but there is a question of whether a vehicle will appear for this to sort of ride on, or if it will sort of get lost in that dysfunction that's sometimes happening right now in Congress. Okay, I'd love to take a moment and talk through our priorities a little bit here. So these fall into three buckets, but they're sort of stacked, most important at the bottom, and then move up from there. So the number one overall priority for the coalition is passing a reauthorization bill. And this is because at a base level, passing a reauthorization bill reaffirms bipartisan congressional support for the Brownfields program. Doing that is the best thing we can do to help ensure the Brownfields program's continued existence. If we want a better foothold for appropriations, passing a reauthorization is an expression of congressional intent that they'd like to invest in that. And then we just have to actually push them to do so. It also allows us to modernize the program and make important tweaks. And we'll discuss some of those modernizations in the other buckets. But just getting the bill across the finish line is a very high priority. Next, we're advocating for increased resources. This is for the program overall, but it's also increasing individual award thresholds and increasing the maximum award for cleanup grants. In addition, and sort of in this bucket, we have staffed the program in regional offices fully to keep projects moving. That is something that the reauthorization bill might delve into, but is also something we include here because it is a reminder to folks that you can pass a big, beautiful reauthorization bill, but if it doesn't have the funding it needed to actually implement it at the agency, none of these programs will be able to move out the door. And so that's why we sort of include it in this bucket, even though the bill may or may not consider it. Next, we have increased flexibility and streamline the program. So we have heard from many folks that the match requirements are for cleanup grants are a barrier to entry, particularly for smaller, under-resourced applicants. And so we are advocating to eliminate the match requirements. We are advocating to decrease the threshold on grant spend to allow for reapplication if reasonable plans to spend the funds are on the books. I read that fully because I think this is an excellent example of the applied expertise that the coalition brings. This is quite a wonky problem. Basically, many members of the coalition, when we were having our priorities conversation, sort of said, you know, I'm spending down my grant as I get it, and I want to reapply for the next one so I can keep a sort of even keel, smooth path of work and sort of plan for the future. But this grant spend requirement means that I'm either sprinting to get something spent or I have to miss a cycle of grant applications because I've got a chunk left. And when we told folks that it breaks continuity, that it doesn't really incentivize what they think it does, congressional offices were very open to that feedback. But that is not something they're going to hear from everybody. And it's also something that's pretty in the weeds. So I think it's a great example of the expertise that we can bring directly to Congress staffers. And then lastly, we have add additional eligibilities under assessment and cleanup grants, such as demolition. And I'll pause here to say that there's more detail on all of these priorities on Smart Growth's website, and we can provide that in our follow-up materials. Okay, now we're going to talk about the FY26 appropriations process. So the president recently released what is called his skinny budget. The skinny budget is essentially his vision of what the administration should be doing. There's a statement, sort of a classic statement about presidential budgets that the president proposes and Congress disposes because Congress has its own ideas about everything. We anticipate something like that will be true this time. However, we have a very empowered executive who's been able to sort of get himself pretty in line with congressional Republicans. And so we do think that there is some extra weight to the president's budget. However, there's a difference between a skinny budget and a full budget. Skinny budget is sort of his top lines, his main takeaways. It's still a several page document, but it doesn't have all the detail we need. So for example, it says in the skinny budget that the president would like to cut 16 EPA categorical grants, of which brownfields could or could not be one. There are roughly 20, give or take, depending on how you count them, categorical grants within EPA. His language also says that he'd like to keep tribal grants untouched. There are 2 tribal grant programs within the categorical grant program. He also says he'd like to cut all but I think it's $100 billion or whatever, $100 million, whatever it is, going to these programs. That amount that he would be leaving over doesn't naturally line up with any collection of the programs that could be remaining. So there's this question of what's the big budget going to be? Is brownfields under threat? It's not really clear. We can't say definitively that the president intends to zero out the brownfields program in his budget, and we can't say yet that he intends to keep it around. We need to see his broader budget, which we anticipate being released in the coming days. I will say just because the president recommends it does not mean Congress does it. And I think particularly with brownfields, there's a very strong bipartisan group of folks who support this program. We have proven case studies, and there's a real opportunity to protect this, even if the president's budget has a steep cut or recommended zeroing out. Now, as I've mentioned, the program is still spending advanced appropriations from the infrastructure law. That was $300 million for FY26. That's this upcoming fiscal year. And that's split between Section 128 grants, that's the state program, project grants, and administrative costs. This is the last fiscal year of those advanced appropriations. So that makes it all the more important that we get that toehold. And then this will be the venue where connecting the Brownfields program and program staff funding with sort of the regional offices and how it's all interconnected in program delivery will be very important for our congressional members, because it's easy when folks are very busy on those Hill staffers to not really get the full picture, that you don't just need somebody to sort of at headquarters to run the program, but you absolutely have to have a strong, robust regional staff to deliver these programs. So we're trying to really carry that message to folks. In terms of where we're at in the process, members of Congress are making appropriations requests right now of the Appropriations Committee. And then the budget will be drafted over this summer, and then we'll see where it goes. Usually each chamber, or at least one chamber, releases draft versions of their bill, their funding bill, and then we see if we actually stitch them all together and we pass them. If we end up on a continuing resolution, again, that would be referring to the previous year's funding levels, or sort of what happens. I will say that in past years, staying on a continuing resolution ends up being a de facto cut because it doesn't account for inflation. And that's sort of one of the primary arguments folks use for updated budgets, is they allow for incremental cost increases across all government programs to ensure continued impact. However, given the strong cutting environment and sort of appetite within Congress at this current moment, there is a chance that a continuing resolution is actually the best possible scenario, because it preserves the funding levels that were originally agreed on for fiscal year 24 in a bipartisan manner. So we'll see. We'll keep our coalition members updated as that moves forward, but that's sort of the general lay of the land there. All right. Now we know that while we've been talking quite a bit about federal policy here, there are many sustained roadblocks to success and sort of full steam ahead. We know that these budget cuts to other programs and other federal agencies are going to continue to impact brownfields work, even if it's sort of indirectly. We know that significant staff reductions and potential impacts on the regional capacity are a concern. And we also know that there's been some ruptured trust with some of the communities we work in, because they were either promised a grant that's now been frozen, or things are sort of remaining unclear as to what will happen there. So we know that there is pending litigation and necessary community partnership work that needs to occur. We also know that there are persistent developer challenges. There's the uncertainty related to tariffs and grant timing, but there's also costs of construction materials and capital stack deficit problems that will go on regardless of if we pass these pieces of legislation. But that is why we need you all to join the movement. Even if we pass reauthorization and the tax deduction and the appropriations bill with a robust brownfields funding, we still need additional members and additional voices explaining the importance of brownfields and really delivering the message that this is how we can, really drive revitalization in our communities. So we'd like to invite everyone who's joined us here who isn't yet a member of the National Brownfields Coalition to join us. If you join us, you're sort of granted access to empowered advocacy, a peek behind the curtain, if you will, at what's actually going on down here in DC, and timely updates about that. You're also connected to a community of practitioners from across the country. with various sort of entry points into the brownfield space. We also have a standing newsletter that folks can sign up for. We'd also like to encourage everyone to contact your representative. We're going to share this slide deck, which has an explicit link where you can click and advocate directly to support the Brownfields redevelopment tax incentive. We can also provide materials as folks are interested to directly contact their Congress member and advocate directly for the broader suite of Brownfields policies. And then lastly, we want to really encourage folks to elevate their projects and their success stories directly to Congress. Tell your member about the good work you're doing. When we went to some of these hearings recently, certain members would have blown up pictures of a project in their district behind them because the people doing that project had communicated to that office that that was the good work being done with EPA Brownfields money in their community. So we really encourage folks, invite members or their staff to visit your projects and share your success stories with us so that if you're stretched thin on capacity, we can help elevate your good stories. All right. I also want to say the Center for Creative Land Recycling, CCLAR, will be at the National Brownfields Conference in August. This year it's August 5th through 8th in Chicago. And they will be at a variety of sessions here. You can kind of peek the list. And we would love to see you there, CCLAR and the National Brownfields Coalition. All right. We're going to pause now for a quick round of questions. Again, a reminder to all attendees that we'll send a follow-up email. We are recording this webinar and we will provide sort of support this deck and some other supporting resources after the convening. So Jean, thanks for jumping back on. Did we have any early questions in the chat?
I do not see any at this time.
Peek at the Q&A.
So I'm hoping that we'll either give you a moment to put some in, or if you have any any clarification or other information. I just also want to reiterate and thank Kennedy because for those of us who are novices on really what happens behind the scenes in Washington, it's been a really breath of fresh air to have her and to really dissect and to share with us this sort of inside process. And it is important during these times that there be ways that we can collect information from all different sources. What's happening on the ground? What are some of your successes and the impact you're making? What are some of your challenges? And to the extent that you can share those with us, here's our contact information. We'd love to have you join as a member. All members can sit on committees. The committees we have are policy, environmental justice, and education and capacity building. So we'd really love to get you engaged and to really contribute to our thought leadership around how to preserve and advance the goals that we have around brownfield redevelopment.
And I do see a few questions in the Q&A, so I'll just take these as I can. One, congrats. I see the County of York, PA received a community-wide assessment grant. Congrats. We were very excited to see that list and to see that money moving. Next, I see, are threshold requirements on spending down existing grant funds statutorily determined? I thought the program decided that. Great point. So we've been in conversation. Legislation can change things that are dictated by agency rules if it so chooses. What it does is it basically clarifies it in legislation that the intent is to do it one thing rather than the other. It is currently a program decision to our understanding, that spend down threshold. So there's a chance that that gets fixed, not in the legislation, but because Congress tells the agency to fix it. So there are more than, that's like a 2 shots on goal situation where we're trying to do it either through legislation or through programmatic adjustments, but either way, notifying Congress of the problem is helpful. Next, does the White House have the power to stop infrastructure-funded brownfields funding from being spent? Great question. That's being actively litigated by lawyers with law degrees, of which I am not one. So I would say on that front, stay tuned. Right now, our knowledge is that that is not occurring broadly. For the EPA brownfields money that is moving through that account. But that is in active litigation, so can't comment beyond that. Next, do you know if EPA brownfields grant funds can be used for coalition membership? Jean, do you have, I don't think so, but
I would think not,
yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
but you can use those funds to attend the National Brownfields Conference, and that would be another great way to connect with us there. As you saw, the National Brownfields Coalition has submitted and has two sessions that are that they'll present at the Brownfields Conference.
Yeah. And then Jean, do you want to talk about different like ways to join the coalition, like different levels and membership and that kind of thing, like some with
Sure.
fees?
If you go to the link, you'll see different levels. And again, the most important thing is to see whether there's a level from entry level, I think at the 500, 1,500, 1,200 up to $10,000 or any contribution you'd like to make. This work can only be done with your support. And obviously, we've increased our investment in being able to track and support this work. So we're willing to work with you. So if you are interested, just reach out to us and we can kind of go through the different membership levels. But if you click on the link that was put in the chat, it will take you to a page where you can kind of see the levels and the different benefits. But everybody who joins as a member can sit on one of those committees that I mentioned.
Yeah. And then there was the next question, is the fiscal year 26, $300 million from the infrastructure law, is it at risk of being cut or reduced, or is that safe? I would say any funding unspent remains at risk. I will say that so far, the brownfields money has continued to go out the door. It hasn't faced the same impoundment risk sort of captured by the executive that other programs have. That said, nothing is safe. We're hopeful, but I don't want to sort of provide false certainty on that front. Okay.
It is really just important to note, although 240, 207 just in the MARC grant, not the supplemental RLF that was granted, is less than 50% of the people who applied. So over 450 applicants applied, about 46% were awarded in this round that was announced on Friday. So you could see how devastating it'd be if we had to actually revert to the $80 million level. So we hope that by building the bipartisan support, and that means getting success stories from you, it means you joining the coalition so that when we do sign-on letters or call to actions, we have a really diverse list of names from every state that's benefited from these grants and the work that you're doing.
Yeah. Somebody asked, are there any private or public funds based on the tax incentives available for brownfield activity? I don't think I quite understand what you're asking there. There are tax incentives at the state level, correct, Jean?
New York State in particular has the Brownfield Cleanup Program, the BCP program, but you'd have to check to see if your state has either grant funds or can support you through a state RLF, or whether it all has any other provisions to support you.
Yeah, but in general,
to get some of that information, we did put a link about your technical assistance to provider, your TAB provider. CClear is the TAB provider for regions 9 and 10. Every community across the country has a TAB provider, and these are also questions that you can we ask them in terms of what are sources of funding, what kind of technical assistance can I get to advance my project?
Yeah, and I think that sort of implicit in that question is, wouldn't it be nice if there was a uniform sort of federal deduction, federal benefit? And that's what the deduction would provide. It would provide even access across the country to an incentive to redevelop some of these difficult properties. I saw, is there a step-by-step guide for smaller projects of brownfield regeneration at a community level? I think that speaks to the tab providers that Jean was mentioning, but Jean, do you want to mention any other resources?
There are a lot, and some of them, there is some wonderful EPA resources. If you're anonymous, so I don't know who asked the question, but if you want to reach out to me, I could put together a compilation of some resources that could be useful to you.
Yeah. Someone else asked, is there any discussion within the Brownfields reauthorization process of granting Alaskan tribes eligibility for MARC grants? Currently, we are not eligible. This would be a great point to contact your congressional office directly about, or to reach out to the coalition about, and so that we can sort of assist you in elevating that concern. But as I've seen it, I do not believe it is in the current legislation, but I would need to revisit it. It's been a moment since I last read it. And then someone said,
There
are there
are other programs for Alaskan tribes, and since we are the technical assistance to brownfield provider in Region 10, you should reach out to me and we can share with you what other resources are available for Alaskan tribes.
There you go. The best possible answer. Get the folks who actually do the work. And then someone asks, are there any federal tax incentives? This is a complicated question. There are many tax incentives that do all sorts of things. New markets tax credits sometimes go into certain designated economically distressed census tracts. You can also see the opportunity zones tax incentive is up for consideration. That's been used sometimes for brownfields projects. I won't over evangelize on it. It's had somewhat limited uptake, but there are federal tax incentives. They just aren't specific to brownfields in the way that that deduction would sort of be an accelerant specifically. I'm going to hop into the general chat here. Is the coalition perhaps working on substantive statutory PFAS liability and exemption issues? At this point, that was not something that the coalition had identified as a priority in the context of the reauthorization bill specifically. However, that's an ongoing conversation, and we are constantly talking to members about new priorities for either the pending legislation or upcoming efforts. So then I see a question here. Are the dollars being redirected that are captured? I think is sort of Anton's question here. So far, we're not aware of any dollars for brownfields being redirected. Other programs are a bit more complex, but I think we're in an okay place at present. I'm just looking for any other questions.
And the person who asked about the step-by-step guide, my colleague at CClear put in a link to at least one free resource that you could take a look at. That's an EPA resource.
Okay. I see that our questions are sort of slowing down a bit. I want to say it's an honor to work on brownfields, work with all of you. Sitting in DC, I can sometimes feel a little separate from the work on the ground, but getting the chance to work with the coalition and hear about the exceptional projects that are funded and the great work that's happening has been like the honor of a lifetime for me. So I'm very excited to keep working on these projects and sort of keep the grind up. And we really need you to join us because as Jean said at the top of the call, it really is to be activated, to be engaged. The more we can get on folks' radar, folks across the political spectrum, we have a winning case here. Brownfield revitalization is great work for communities of all kinds. And so we would love to have your voice and have you join us. So please do explore that link to join. We appreciate your time and don't hesitate to follow up with any questions.
We would also love to do a training for Hill Day, how to work with you so that you can reach out to your representative for those who may not have that experience. So if you're in touch with us and want to suggest other webinars you'd like to see us do, or whether that could include, just how to approach your representative, that might be something that we would be able to put together that we think would be beneficial in preparation for a Hill Day or some other way that further engagement with representatives we think could be very beneficial.
Okay. Thank you all. Stay tuned for some follow-up materials here in the coming days. Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.